that you guys are wondering whether I was Christian or Jewish or atheist or what have you. So, sorry, I just ate a piece of granola. That was a bad choice. I'd say my religious beliefs are, I'm agnostic. So I don't really know whether there is a God. I don't think anyone knows whether there's a God. I don't really believe in any established religion. I was raised, my dad is Christian and my mom is Jewish, so I was raised both. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. So, conclusion is agnostic.
Conclusion is agnostic. Culturally, mixture of Christian and Jewish.
Okay. A good North. There we go.
Put in X. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So, with that out of the way, shall we begin?
Yep.
All right. Let me set things up. All right. So, oh, that's my face. All right. All right. So, everyone can hear me okay? Yeah. I don't have QQ open on my screen still. Alright, sounds good. Seems like everyone can hear me. Alright, great. So yeah, this presentation is on Thomas Aquinas. As always, my name is Trevor Klee. Haven't changed it since last time. Not that it's important, but Aquinas is not his last name. Aquinas means from Aquino, which is the city where he grew up and was born. Also, I know when you guys looked at slides and whatever, this was really difficult. I promise I'll go slowly. I'll explain things. This was difficult for everyone. It took me a while to sort of simplify it from what it was. So I'll take my time with this one and let me know if I'm going too fast. All right. So, little introduction to our man Thomas Aquinas. So, he was an Italian Dominican friar and priest, living from 1225 to 1274. Dominican here means belonging to a certain religious order, like a part of Catholicism, the Dominican order. As a friar, he had to obey by vows of chastity, so no wife, poverty, so no money, and obedience, always obeying the church. And he had to serve society, which was an important part of being a friar. It's this idea of like, you're serving society, you're not just serving the church. So, saw your message, yeah. So he attempted to synthesize Aristotelian thought in Christianity. So he tried to put together, to combine into one. On the one hand, like the philosophy of Aristotle, Plato's student, Plato was Socrates' student, Christianity, and he largely succeeded, and it was this union that would last for 400 years. And actually, so like, when like Galileo or Copernicus, these scientists in like the 1600s, 1500s are coming up with their really revolutionary ideas, like the Earth revolves around the sun. Not only are people arguing that's against Christianity, they also argue it's against Aristotle, which is pretty astonishing. That's how successful Thomas Aquinas was. he sort of made Aristotle one of the unofficial authorities of Christianity. The reason why he's important today is, he's now a saint, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and he's actually required reading if you want to become a priest. So if you become a priest, I don't know if any of you want to become a priest in the Catholic Church, probably not. Then you guys would have to read and understand Thomas Aquinas. So this would be a great head start. According to the pre-reading, Bertrand Russell, he thinks Aquinas is a good philosopher, but overrated. So his good points are, to quote Mr. Russell, when Aquinas wishes to refute some doctrine, he states it first, often with great force, and almost always with an attempt at fairness. Okay, so when he disagrees with someone, he gives them like a fair shake. He states their case plainly and logically. All right. The sharpness and clarity with which he distinguishes arguments derived from reason and arguments derived from revelation are admirable. So that just means he distinguishes stuff he came logically through stuff that the church gave him. He knows Aristotle well and understands him thoroughly, which cannot be said of any earlier Catholic philosophy. But the appeal to reason is, in a sense, insincere, since the conclusion to be reached is fixed and advanced. Or in other words, Thomas Aquinas isn't a real philosopher. He's not starting with this Socratic idea of, I know nothing. What he's really starting with is this, he knows some things. He knows God exists. He knows the Bible is largely right. And he's trying to use logic to back him up. So he's not a great philosopher in that sense. The reason why I want to cover him, and I think he's important to cover, is his importance. And it's also, he's going to be the first guy we talk about who's really, he's not like Socrates, who is coming up with a lot of this stuff, sort of on his own, just thinking. He's a product of his times. We're going to have to understand everything that he read, not everything, but the main things he read, the main things he believed, and the main things that influenced him, before we can understand why he thought what he thought, which makes him interesting, and that's going to be more or less true for philosophers after this, because everyone's going to end up reading, having more and more stuff to read, and more stuff to understand. We can't come up with new things anymore, because, the Greeks covered a lot of ground. All right. Cool. So, here we have Thomas Aquinas on the right. You can see he's writing something with the ink pen right here. And he also has a halo. This is how they always drew halos back then. I know it sort of just looks like a golden hat, but it is a halo, believe it or not. So, obviously, at this point, he's been canonized as a saint. So, Thomas Aquinas was born to a wealthy family in Sicily during time of conflict between Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX. So, a couple things to note here. One, Sicily is a weird place during this time. It had been conquered by the Muslims for 200 years. It had passed, over the past 500 years, it had passed hands between a bunch of different rulers. So it's a very cosmopolitan place. There's a lot of different influences, including Muslim influences, including Catholic influences. All right, so the other thing we have to notice here is this is a conflict between an emperor and a pope. And that's not an argument. They both have armies, and they are fighting with each other. So if you ask yourself, why is it that a pope not only has an army, but has an army so powerful that he's going to fight against an emperor? If you start asking yourself those questions, you can start understanding the influences of Thomas Aquinas. He was living in an era where the church wasn't just the religious authority. You know, they had an army. All right, so as he was born to this wealthy family, they wanted him to have an important position. So they wanted to become an abbot, which means a head of a monastery. You would think that like a head of a monastery shouldn't be an important position, like they should be like poor and whatever. But no, being an abbot, you could be wealthy, you could have a wife if you kept it quiet. So it wasn't a bad position for the like third son of a rich family. But Thomas Aquinas decided in his teenage years he wanted to become a friar. Which again, if you think of it, no wife, vow of poverty, you can think how a wealthy family, they're not going to be happy about it. And they weren't. They were actually so against him becoming a friar, you know, him refusing all money, refusing a wife. They kidnapped him and held him prisoner for a year. His own family kidnapped him. And according to legend, while he was imprisoned in a castle, in his family's castle, his brothers hired a prostitute to try to persuade him that maybe women are pretty good. And Sir Thomas, or St. Thomas rather, picked up a poker, so those iron sticks in the fire that you use to poke the fire. So he picks up a poker from the fire and he chases her out of his room, basically saying, you know, you have to leave or I will beat you with this red-hot iron stick. So apparently he was not much of a ladies' man. All right. So as he got older, he became a famous professor, famous preacher. He wrote many works, many works. Basically an incredible amount. And then he became so famous, you know, people were starting to think maybe he would become a saint. And even though supposedly the reason he became a saint was because of his scholastic ability, because of, you know, all of his writings, because of how famous a thinker he was, when the Catholic Church decides someone's a saint, they have to say that they performed some miracle. So you'll always see weird stories like this. One of these for Thomas Aquinas is supposedly he could levitate. So he could float above the ground. And someone said they saw him like praying once and he was floating. I don't know. It's just what the Catholic Church does. You'll see that with a couple saints. They'll be like, oh yeah, this is the reason why he's a saint. Also, like, he can set things on fire with his mind. I don't think they actually have any of those, but they do have like levitation and healing the sick miraculously and all that stuff. All right, keep going. So I made this diagram using all the artistic tools at my disposal. If you guys want to hire me to create diagrams for you, you can hire me for a mere price of $10,000 per hour, US, which is worth it because I'm such an expert. So here's a diagram. Catholic Church, Dominican friars, Thomas Aquinas, right? So this is on the one hand. Catholic Church is, of course, coming from Jesus, so around year 0. Dominican friars, they're not the only friars out there, but they were very influential. They were started not that long before Aquinas was born. And then on the other hand, we've got more influences coming on the right side. So we start with Socrates, who you guys are now experts on. Socrates teaches Plato. Plato teaches Aristotle. And then sort of the age of the Greeks ends. Islamic scholars, so, you know, Muslim scholars, Arabic scholars, they discover Aristotle, and they want to preserve him. So they basically write down all of his stuff. They translate it into Arabic. They comment on it. And so then we get to Thomas Aquinas. So again, Thomas Aquinas, he lives in Sicily. Sicily actually, in the government, Arabic was one of the 3 languages of the government. There's Latin, Arabic, and the local language. So Thomas Aquinas almost certainly, I don't know if he understood Arabic, but he certainly saw the translations and commentaries on Aristotle while he was, still pretty young. All right. So let's go deep into it. So I know we haven't talked about Aristotle much, but as I did mention, he is incredibly influential. I don't talk about him directly because I think his philosophy isn't great. By the way, if you guys hear a noise in the background, sorry, they are cleaning outside. I don't talk about Aristotle directly. I don't think his philosophy is great, but I do have to admit it's incredibly important. Well, for the Europeans anyways, up until maybe year 1600, 1700. And there are a couple people who even follow him now. So Aristotle, student of Plato, writes about everything, writes about philosophy, writes about science, writes about math. So it's taken up by the Islamic world, and as you know from your history classes, Europe, while the Islamic world is, flourishing, Europe is going through the Dark Ages after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And a lot of Europe is too worried about getting, sort of killed by the Vikings to care too much about Aristotle. Also, someone else who we'll be talking about eventually is the Jews who take up Aristotle's work, including Maimonides, who is a Jewish scholar living in the Arab world. In the 12th century, so 1100s, he's translated from Arabic to Latin. During Aquinas' lifetime, Aristotle is incredibly controversial. There are fights over him. There are fights over whether or not he's threatening the authority of the church. Aquinas almost gets in a lot of trouble for it. Gets in a little trouble for it. Eventually, they give up. Aristotle becomes accepted. And Albertus Magnus, who was a pretty great philosopher in his own right, and I'd love to teach more about him, but lack of time, has this quote: "Know that a man is not perfected in philosophy if it weren't for the knowledge of the 2 philosophers, Aristotle and Plato." So Albertus Magnus, he's another Dominican friar, another famous Dominican friar. That's the sort of regard in which he holds Aristotle and Plato in. That's the regard that Thomas Aquinas holds Aristotle in, even though Aristotle, of course, isn't Christian, because he died well before the birth of Christ. All right. So, and then the other side of the influence historical background is the Dominican order. So again, they're formed because there's this idea that the church is grown too wealthy, has too much money. They don't care about the people anymore. They don't really care about Christianity anymore. You can understand how they think that when they're dealing with a church that's, has an army and the richest organization in Europe. So the Dominicans are formed to preach among the people. So they're mendicants, and that's a word that means they're poor, and they're poor by choice. The reason that is because monks would support themselves by farming, which means they never had to interact with people. Dominicans could only support themselves by preaching to people, and then people would give them money and food in exchange. So it, kept them interacting with people because they didn't have any choice. Otherwise, they would starve. But despite that, they were very well organized, very highly educated, and quickly became a powerful organization in their own right. And again, as we mentioned, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas' mentor, was one of the first Europeans to read Islamic translations and comment on Aristotle. So these were educated people of the ancient European world. All right. So, Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, what we're here for, what we care about. So again, as I mentioned, there's a huge amount of written text. I've tried to sort of simplify it and whatever as much as possible. If we wanted to go through all of it, for example, if we all wanted to become Catholic priests, we would be here, for the next, 6 months. But you guys probably would get bored after the first 3 months. So let's not do that. So he is, a religious authority. He eventually becomes a saint, although not during his lifetime. So he writes both on theology and philosophy. And philosophy, as I've mentioned, as for him, there's no difference in talking about God, talking about free will, and talking about, for instance, science. All of these things are sort of things he talks about. And, for example, his mentor wrote a lot on classifying birds. And that was not something that was weird. He didn't think of that as separate from thinking about the nature of things. He also thought about the nature of birds. So because his philosophy, Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, so highly regarded by the Catholic Church, it gets this strange position of being non-debatable, which means you can't, according to the Catholic Church, you can't disagree with any of it. You can't even think to disagree with any of it. So, of course, I don't believe that, because I'm not Catholic, and I'm encouraging you guys to think critically about what Thomas Aquinas wrote, same way you think critically about what anyone wrote. But this is the Catholic Church's official position on it, and this is a guy living from 1835 to 1914, so pretty recently. He's Pope. The capital theses in the philosophy of St. Thomas, so the capital theses being the, sort of most important things he wrote, are not to be placed in the category of opinions capable of being debated one way or another. So they're not something you can argue about, but they are to be considered as the foundations upon which the whole science of natural and divine things is based. So everything that we think is based on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. If such principles are once removed or in any way impaired, it must necessarily follow that students of the sacred sciences will ultimately fail to perceive so much as the meaning of the words in which the dogmas of divine revelation are proposed by the magistracy of the Church. Which is a very fancy way of saying, if you ever argue with Thomas Aquinas, you're going to wreck the connection between science and the Church, and in fact, anyone who studies science will totally be unable to understand what the Church is saying. So don't question Thomas Aquinas. And again, this is a guy writing in 19th century, 20th century. This is someone who's still saying, after we've discovered electricity and whatever, he's still saying, but we have to listen to this guy from the 1200s. Pretty crazy. All right. So, on to Thomas Aquinas' actual philosophy, which is probably what you guys had trouble with, and I don't blame you. It's very complicated. I'm just going to go over what he believed, and then we're going to go through why he believed what he did. So, he gets this, first things first, he gets this idea from Aristotle that everything is made up of what it is and what it does. So, for instance, how would you describe a cup? Or how would you define a cup? It's wooden, it's got a hole here, the hole extends through here, it's got a bottom, it's small enough that you can pick it up with your hand. And the other way you can describe a cup is something that holds water or any sort of liquid, right? And that's the purpose of a cup. So Aristotle says that's how you would define a cup. And you'll see this sort of classification show up again and again when Thomas Aquinas discusses things. What it is and what it does. Or what it is and what it's for. So in terms of classifying, everything can be divided into the living and the non-living. All right, which makes sense. You know, if you think of people who don't know science as we know it, they only see what's around them. They see things that are living. They see trees. They see things that are non-living, rocks. So the living is made up of that which acts and that which is acted on. And again, you see how they're like classifying and classifying, dividing and dividing. They constantly do this. They're classifying things, their favorite hobby. All right. So that which acts, the soul. So don't, the concept of the soul gets confusing, but for now you can think of it as like mind, will, whatever. It's what makes you actually do things. And then the sort of dead part is your body. It's just what has to do what the soul tells it. All right. So let's describe the soul a little more. It's given, man is given every essential degree of perfection by the soul. So not every living thing gets every degree of perfection by the soul, because not everything thinks. But, something confusing here is this word perfection. I assume you know what perfect means in a sort of normal way. Like if I say, oh, that's a perfect piece of writing, I mean, it's really good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. When someone like Thomas Aquinas uses the term perfection, he is this very, very complicated concept that basically means part of the aspects of God. It's like God is completely perfect, and then man's given like every part of what makes God perfect, although not to the same amount that God gets. So man, us, also woman, can live, we can be, and we can think. All right? Meanwhile, a tree can live and be. A rock, well, can't really do any of those. All right. So, a couple other things. So, we see things with our eyes, but we understand them with our soul/intellect. So now he's going beyond classifying man. He's talking about the outside world. He's saying the way we understand the outside world is we need to understand them with our soul, by which he means what we think our brain. Doesn't sound too crazy, right? And then finally, last thing on this section anyways, is God is perfect, and by perfect he means this idea, and he is the same as what he does. So again, that's a very complicated topic, but remember, a cup is both this like wooden thing with a hole in it that you can put on a table, and it's also something you use to drink water. According to Thomas Aquinas, God is the same as what he does. So the purpose of God is the same as what makes up God. We won't go into that too much more. All right. Oh wait, do you guys like the pictures of the cute animals? They'll make sense in a sec, but I just thought they were adorable as well. Sort of makes you want to get a pet goat, doesn't it? All right. Maybe not a pet cow, even though that's pretty cute too. So back to philosophy though. So here's the stuff that really gets into the meat, the important things, what Thomas Aquinas believes. So first he believes, everything is either, everything you see is being, right? It exists. So there are two fundamental axioms, or two fundamental rules, or two rules which can't be broken, of being. Non-contradiction and principle of causality. Non-contradiction can't contradict itself. So for instance, you couldn't be like, this is an animal which is a cow and not a cow. Doesn't work, right? It's either this animal is a cow or this animal is not a cow. And you also have principle of causality. Everything is caused by something else. Everything happens from something else. So, for example, a cow comes from its mom, right? Comes from mother cow and a daddy cow or a bull. You can't have a cow just coming out of nowhere. And so Thomas Aquinas argues anything can theoretically exist which does not violate these two principles. All right? So he doesn't say anything exists which doesn't violate this and this, but he can imagine anything as long as it's caused by something and it doesn't contradict itself. All right. So now let's talk about how do we even talk about things, right? So he's really getting into the weeds here. So when we're talking about logical things, when we're talking about our proofs, we have three different ways of describing things. We have univocality, general descriptives. So these are things which make sense that we use to describe it for two different things. Milk from cows, milk from goats. Both of those are milk. They're not the same thing, but it makes sense we use the same word for both of them. There's the analogy, which compares things. And again, these analogies make sense. They're not the same thing, and they're not as close as milk from cows and milk from goats. But you can understand why we use them. Healthy animals and healthy food. This animal is healthy because it's not sick. This food is healthy because it doesn't make you sick. All right? And the last way of describing things, and by describing I mean using descriptors, right? Using the same words, is equivocation, which is using the same word for two different things. And according to Aquinas, that's what you end up with confusion, right? Hard surface and a hard test. So what do those have to do with each other? Nothing really. But we use the same word anyways, and that can definitely cause confusion. All right? So, other things that Thomas Aquinas believes, and we're almost done, I promise. This is difficult and stressful, for sure. Everything is caused by something else, as we talked about, and everything has an ultimate purpose. So this is a weird belief, and as we'll discuss, he gets it from Aristotle. But everything has a purpose. He doesn't see anything happening as just like by accident or it's just the way it is. He's saying like everything is trying to achieve something. Everything is going somewhere. All right? So, sort of related to that is the idea is God acts in everything. Okay? Everything and everyone according to their nature. So first of all is this idea God acts in everything and everyone. So when you're doing things, God is acting through you. And it's according to your nature. Or according to its nature. If it's a tree, presumably it's just going to grow and get leaves. But if it's a bad person, they're going to do bad things. They're not going to choose to do bad things. But here's where it gets weird. And I don't know if you've covered Calvinism with Goethe, but this is sort of related. God knows you're bad, so he makes you do bad things. And then you still get sent to hell afterwards. It's a little unfair. It's a lot unfair. You know, you're born with 3 strikes against you, to use a baseball analogy. All right. And finally, people only really know things when what they know can be seen in the outside world. So this is Aquinas' definition of knowledge. He's not saying if it's logical. He's not saying if you can form an argument for it, then you know things. He's saying the only way you really know things is when once you prove it or whatever, you can see it in the outside world. In some ways, this makes him somewhat of a philosopher, or somewhat of a scientist, I mean, right? This importance of once you think of something, you need to see it in the outside world. On the other hand, it sort of takes him away too, because it depends on what exactly you're seeing in the outside world. You can convince yourself you're seeing a lot of things. All right. This was difficult. This was a lot of stuff. We're going to head back to this later. I hope you guys just understand the basics of it for now. Just as long as you understand what he's talking about. All right. So, why does Thomas Aquinas have all these weird beliefs? Where are these coming from? Because, like, we come from Socrates, who you sort of make sense with what he believes. And then you get to Thomas Aquinas, who's saying all this random stuff. And you're not quite sure where he's getting this from or, you know, why he's wasting his time on this. Well, as I said, we can only understand Thomas Aquinas as a product of his times. So I've added a bit to my super fancy diagram here. So first we've got the influences on the Catholic Church side. So we've got Jewish beliefs, right? After all, you know, Christianity was started by a Jew, by Jesus. So we've got Jewish beliefs, which are sort of taken into the Catholic Church. And then these beliefs are then transformed and added to by various thinkers, including St. Augustine. And then these beliefs are like added to by Dominican friars. And finally, Thomas Aquinas gets this whole thing. And that's what he learns. Meanwhile, we've also got, on the other hand, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So all these Greek philosophers sort of translated and commented on by Islamic scholars. And so all of these also given to Thomas Aquinas. So everything that Thomas Aquinas believes is influenced by these two huge systems of thought. It's pretty complicated. And it's a difficult position for Aquinas to be in because he believes both of them. And up until this point, no one's trying to put these two together. And trying to put these two together results in some weird stuff, because it is, again, two huge systems of belief. So let's talk about Aristotle. So what does Aristotle believe? So if you're Aristotle, you're the student of Plato, which means you're the student of Socrates. So Aristotle is looking out into the world. He's trying to understand the outside world. And you've seen how the way Socrates questions things. He says, what is this? What is that? How do we know this? How do we know that? So if you're looking at a cup on the table and you start asking yourself questions, like what is a cup? What is a table? How do you know that one is on top of the other? Why doesn't the cup fall through the table? How do you know that the cup won't fall through the table in an hour? So there are all these things that you've sort of assumed and you've never thought about. But once you start really questioning them, you're going to get into a lot of difficulty. So if you're someone like Aristotle, you know, this very learned guy, he forms a school, whatever, you come up with this intensive system of classification. So you try to understand things by categorizing what they're made up of, what caused them to happen. So what is this cup made up of? How did it get on the table? And what their purpose is. And so what their purpose is ends up being this sort of complicated thing of what's the purpose of a cup on the table? So it's not the purpose of who put them there. The purpose for Aristotle is the cup ultimately wants to fall on the ground. This is what Aristotle comes up with. The reason why a cup falls on the ground if you push it off a table is because its purpose is to be on the ground. So you'll see this same sort of logic in Thomas Aquinas' arguments, where he's constantly trying to figure out what's the purpose of these things. And so, now we know it's gravity and whatever, but it was a different answer. So, for instance, Aristotle, looking at the natural world, he's a learned man, he's traveled over Greece, he's traveled over Africa. He's never seen an animal with tusks and horns. And you know what tusks are, right? They're like the big teeth that, say, like a elephant has. So an elephant has tusks, right? Then horns, hopefully that's what, cows have, that's what rhinoceroses have. So Aristotle says no animal has both these, tusks, these big teeth, and these horns, because that wouldn't be necessary. He's saying there's no purpose to it. The purpose that a horn would serve is already served by a tusk. That's the way Aristotle thinks about the world. So, Thomas Aquinas is getting this system of classification of where do things come from, of what's their purpose, of, what are they made up of. And then he's also getting this whole system of thought from Christianity. So, the Christians come with the Jewish view of God, which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere. And they also get these new concepts. So some of these new concepts, or the best person to look at when we're talking about these new concepts, are Augustine of Hippo, who's living basically during the Dark Ages. He's, by the way, really entertaining if you ever want to read about him. First of all, he has a lot of interesting thoughts about all sorts of things. Second of all, he lives sort of this crazy life where for the first 20, 25 years of his life, he's, going drinking, he's going partying, he's sleeping with all sorts of strange women. And then all of a sudden he's like, wait, this is terrible. I shouldn't have done that. I regret all of this. Which is source of this famous quote, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet. So basically, let me never sleep with another girl, let me never drink another drop of alcohol, but not right now. And that was when he was still partying. He wanted to stop, but he didn't want that badly to stop. All right. By the way, here we have a painting of him where truth, veritas, the light, is going directly into his heart. All right. And, both are sort of impacting his brain here. It's not that subtle. They're pretty obvious about it. All right. So what are the ideas of St. Augustine? So he has a couple. Well, he has a bunch, but a couple we're going to cover. So first, we've got body and soul are separate, but married to each other. So again, remember, we've got this idea of a body, and then we've got a soul, which is this thing inside you. It thinks for you. It's tells you what's good, what's bad. So they're separate from each other, but they're married to each other. And they can't be separated, and the soul tells the body what to do. All right? Other ideas. So our perception is granted to us by God. So when we see things in the outside world, we're not actually seeing things. God is allowing us to see things, and everything we see through God. So this is sort of the opposite of a scientist. He's just like, you don't see anything. Everything you see is just God telling you things. On the other hand, it's a little weird. He's not as religious as you think. So he says things like, well, you can't always interpret the Bible literally. Sometimes it's just a metaphor. And part of the reason he does this is he has his own weird interpretation of the Bible in which he basically makes up a bunch of stuff and then is like, look, it's in the Bible. And the Catholic Church, even though they've made him a saint, is still sort of dealing with it. And they're like, The stuff he made up about the Bible we sort of ignore. But he does have these sorts of beliefs. And the Catholic Church does say, okay, yeah, sometimes the Bible is a metaphor. Two last things. One, free will, ability to choose what you do. Augustine has this weird version of it, which the Catholic Church takes up. People have free will, but when they sin, they lose free will. So you're allowed to do whatever you want. You can choose to do whatever you want. But the more you do bad things, the less you're allowed to do whatever you want. Until eventually, you do so many bad things that the only things you can do are bad things, and you lose the ability to do good things. And last thing, and again, this might surprise you, because he is, after all, Catholic Church. Catholic Church isn't known for encouraging people to question what they're saying, is St. Augustine is actually really big on critical thinking. He's like, don't accept everything I say, you have to think about it, you should argue about it, whatever. And then it's sort of ironic that the Catholic Church later on is like, but don't argue with anything Thomas Aquinas says. There are various factions within the Catholic Church. Some of them are more okay with critical thought than others. So, why do we care about this? Well, when Thomas Aquinas, he gets this two huge systems of thought. He gets the Greek system of thought and the Christian system of thought. And he's trying to put them together. He really likes both of them. So he ends up with the system of classification, where everything revolves around God, and the soul which God puts into everything. And you'll see, all of his thought ends up being it's Aristotle, but with God and souls. By the way, this is a picture I found online when I searched God. The guy claims this isn't Photoshop, but it looks pretty Photoshop to me. I don't know. It seems a little questionable. So, what do I mean by everything revolves around God? I mean, Thomas Aquinas says God is the cause of things. He's the result of things. Remember, Aristotle really cares about the cause and result of various things. Aquinas just answers God. Aristotle has all these rules about everything has to be caused by something else. Aquinas just says, well, yes, except for God. Things that Aristotle has difficulty with, like free will or, how we think about things, Thomas Aquinas just says, God. So he does add a little bit to Aristotle's system of thought, but a lot of it is just him saying, yeah, but have you considered putting God in there? So let's see. So we've got this idea from Aristotle, right? Everything is made up of what it is and what it does. Okay, and we get the idea of, the cup. Okay. Everything can be divided into living and the non-living. Living is made up of that which acts and that which is acted on. Okay. So Aristotle was okay with the idea of the soul. Except Aristotle didn't mean it as you're granted something by God. He's just this is the part of your body that thinks. He was just trying to figure out, where are you thinking? And he's the soul, it's something in your body that's thinking. Thomas Aquinas takes this and runs with it. He says, okay, soul, I already know that from Christianity. The soul is the thing that gets you into heaven. So he's Aristotle already mentions it, so let's just put everything that we already think about the soul onto Aristotle's idea of the soul is the thing that's thinking. Okay, so he's saying, well, the soul also allows you to live and to be. And he's well, those are all things that, we know God created man. So, therefore, if the soul is giving us this, that means it's giving us degrees of perfection, and God is all perfect. And as I mentioned before, perfection is this closeness to God, which it gets super complicated depending on your view of God, because Aquinas also, as I'll mention again, he plays pretty fast and loose with his language, by which I mean he uses words, he sometimes uses words in a deliberately confusing way, so it's harder to understand his argument, which means it's harder to disagree with him. It's not a great tactic, and it's like the opposite of what Socrates does. But he does that. So, for example, when he says stuff about like every essential degree of perfection, he's being deliberately vague. Okay, so we see things with our eyes, we'll understand them with our soul. Again, so he's trying to, Aristotle's just saying we understand them with like our mind. Augustine's saying we understand them just through God, and God grants us everything. Aquinas is like, well, wait a minute. I already said that the soul that Aristotle talks about is the same soul that gets you into heaven. So what if I just combine those two? What if I say, okay, I agree we see things with our eyes, Aristotle, but we're understanding them with our soul, Augustine. And again, when we get God is perfect and he is the same as what he does, so here we get what it is and what it does. Aquinas just says, oh yeah, let me just make sure that you know how important God is and say God's the same as what he does. Look, he's like breaking the rules of Aristotle. Look at how cool God is. So this is the way Aquinas thinks about things. So, what about his other stuff? So we get two fundamental axioms of being, non-contradiction and principle of causality. Anything can exist as long as it doesn't contradict itself. We're not saying it's a cow and not a cow. And everything is caused by something else. Okay? Aquinas, he's saying, well, this permits miracles. That means all the things that don't seem to make sense in the Bible, there's a story of Joshua. He like stops the sun from rotating around the earth, which is, the way they thought about it back then. Now we'd say the earth rotating around the sun. He's saying, well, doesn't contradict itself, and it's caused by something. So yeah, sure, that could have happened. Here we get Thomas Aquinas' three ways of describing something, which, are largely taken from Aristotle. Univocality, analogy, equivocation. So he's trying to straighten out this logic for proofs, but this is not great, because he's like, really big on, oh yeah, I'm very careful with all my words, and then he uses words like perfection in like 16 different ways and confuses everyone. But, okay, everything is caused by something else. Everything has an ultimate purpose, all right? So Aristotle, again, combination. Aristotle's like, okay, everything's caused by something else. Everything has a purpose. For Thomas Aquinas, he just says everything has an ultimate purpose. Yes, like right now the purpose might be to, fall down on the ground, but really the ultimate purpose is God. God acts in everything and everyone according to their nature. So, this is Aristotle categorizing human beings. There are bad people, there are good people, there are trees, there are rocks, there's everything, right? According to its nature. And then he throws God in there. He says, God is acting through you. So, people only really know things when what they know can be seen in the outside world. On the one hand, that's like Aristotle's science. Let's pay attention to the outside world. Let's not just try to come up with everything through thinking. Meanwhile, he's saying, oh yeah, also, even things that don't seem quite logical, like God, like miracles, whatever, like, as long as people have seen them, that means they're okay. That means they happen. And by the way, we're going to hopefully get to this great essay eventually by Hume called On Miracles, where he sort of demolishes this whole thing. He basically tells Aquinas 400 years later, you are so wrong about this. which I'm sure will be great for you guys because I imagine you're getting a little annoyed at Thomas Aquinas at this point. But, all right, done with the first section. Take a breather. Whew. So, we have Thomas Aquinas's Quinque Viae. All right, so this literally means 5 ways. Viae, ways, quinque, 5, to prove the existence of God. So he's going to use basically Aristotelian logic, so logic from Aristotle. He's going to use Aristotelian terms from Aristotle, and he's going to use it for the purpose of Christianity. And as we go through these, and we're going to go through them sort of more generally, or I'm going to guide you through them first, and then time permitting, we're going to go through them more, well, a little more literally. I want you guys to remember Russell's criticism. Everything is fixed in advance. So some of the logic here, it's a little questionable, but remember, he's not really trying to prove the existence of God in the way someone like Socrates would. For Thomas Aquinas, God already exists. This is just like a thing he's doing. Like for, you know, it's an intellectual exercise. But it's like trying to prove, I don't know, that you brushed your teeth this morning to your mom. You already know you brushed your teeth this morning. Like, you're going to go through it for her sake. But, like, at the end of the day, you're just going to be like, listen, I know I brushed my teeth. Mom, stop arguing with me. All right? So, argument 1. Doesn't this look fun? This looks like a lot of fun. Yes. All right. So, let me just read through it. I'll explain the difficult words, and then we'll go on to my explanation of the argument. So, the first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. Manifest here means things that you can see, things that exist, things that are obvious. It is certain and evident to our senses, so it's certain and, you know, obvious to us, that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. And this you're probably okay with so far. And here he gets into really, really Aristotelian logic. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. So remember, Aristotle thinks about everything as where it is and where it's supposed to be. So for Aquinas, things are not so much in motion as they already had the possibility going somewhere else, and this is just getting them to that other place. If you think of a cup falling, again, it's in motion because it's just trying to get to the ground. It had the potential of being on the ground, now it's actually going to the ground. Whereas a thing moves in as much as it is an act. We'll just leave that aside for now. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So moving is nothing else than transforming a cup from being on the ground to actually being on the ground. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Ugh. Nothing nothing can be nothing can be made to happen. You can't make the cup fall unless it's something that's already happening. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. So this is weird. And this is, again, Aristotelian science. So wood is potentially hot. What we would call as wood as combustible, you can light it on fire. For someone like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, wood is potentially hot. And the way Aquinas says is that's moving it and changing it. It's moving it from being potentially hot to actually hot. So now it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. So what in God's name does that mean? Sorry, I shouldn't take God's name like that. Aquinas would be very mad at me. All right. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. So that makes sense. When you actually think about it, he's saying it can't be both hot and potentially hot. The wood can't be, you can't have the ability to put wood on fire while it's actually on fire, but it can be potentially cold. So it's, while wood's on fire, it can be potentially cold. You can make wood no longer on fire by throwing a bucket of water on it. All right? So he says, it is therefore impossible that in the same respect, in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e. that it should move itself. So he's saying in the same way, wood can't be on fire and you can potentially put it on fire. That means a thing can't be both mover and moved. So you can't move yourself. So therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. Okay, that by which it is put in motion, be itself put in motion, then this also needs to be put in motion by another, and that by another again. Alright, which makes sense, right? You keep going back and back, things move it's something else, things move something else, things move something else. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover. So something has to move things first. Seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover. So here we've actually got him being pretty smart. He's saying it's like conservation of energy, right? You only move things as much as you're put in motion. You know, the wood only burns if it's hot enough. Alright, as staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Yeah, so if you're like pushing a stick, it's going to move. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other. This everyone understands to be God. So, summarizing that. First, let's use Aquinas' words. Fact. Here, I've done this in somewhat formal logic. Fact, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, and it is impossible that a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Right? Here are my facts that anything that's put into motion is put into motion, but anything that's in motion was put into motion by something else, and nothing can move itself. So, therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Alright, using my own words, so Aristotelian argument, like again, this is Aquinas using Aristotle to defend Christianity. So what would Aristotle say? He would say everything can be described as what it's doing right now and what it could be doing. So how do you change something from what it is doing to what it could be doing? You have to act on it, right? You have to push the cup off the table. Well, what allowed that thing to act? Something else. How do you get the energy to push a cup off the table? Well, you had to eat breakfast that morning. So you trace that back and back and back. What was the first actor to set everything into motion? God. So, by the way, so the next one we're going to go through is the idea of causes. So the connection between movers and causes is complicated because for Aristotle, the cause of something, and so Aquinas, the cause of something, is not necessarily what you would think of immediately. It's also the idea of like one very important cause for Aristotle is how did the thing get the material that makes it up? So for instance, one of the causes of the tree, well, Aristotle didn't know this, but we know this, is the air, right? The tree gets carbon from the air, that's what makes wood. The cause of a cow is the grass it eats. because that's how a cow gets, matter. That's how a cow gains weight. It has to eat grass. So causing and moving, it gets complicated, and that's why Aquinas separates these out into different arguments, even though we think they're very similar, and they are. All right, so let's actually go through the second argument. Second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find that there is an order of efficient causes. And the efficient cause here is just what makes something else happen. And that means it in like every way. That's energy, that's matter. So there is no case known, neither, and is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. And here where he's saying nothing can cause itself, so it would be prior to itself, he means here both in time, so it would have to exist before it itself exists, and he also means in this sort of chain of logic. Prior to itself, in like a chain of logic, it's one before itself. All right, so now in efficient causes, it's not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes following an order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate cause is the cause of ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. So this is pretty weird. He's saying everything has an ultimate cause. So not only does everything start with something, everything has to end somewhere. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Remember, for Aquinas, it's really big on what's the purpose of all of this. So if there is no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate cause. Which makes sense, right? If there's no first cause, then there will be no ultimate cause. You're never going to end up with your ultimate, the thing which started everything, like, there needs to be something to start everything. Yeah. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. So the reason why Aquinas puts this in here is there were philosophers who disagreed with Aristotle around the same time as Aristotle, who answered questions like this just by saying it's an infinite chain. Like, there's no first cause, it just goes back and back and back and back. So Thomas Aquinas, he says, well, if there's no first cause, then there's no ultimate effect, which doesn't seem like a great answer, because we would probably just be like, well, yeah, okay, there's no ultimate effect, there's no like ultimate thing we're going to. But Aquinas just sort of gives up and just says like, well, this is all wrong. This can't be true. And he says, therefore, it's necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. All right. So here again, I'm going to put this in a logical argument using Aquinas' words. There's no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Nothing causes itself, and if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no efficient cause, neither there will be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. So there's no way for something to cause itself. You can't have an infinite chain, because then you won't have an ultimate effect. Therefore, we need a first cause, which we call God. So, using my words, everything has a purpose or an end, and everything is caused by something else. If you move up the chain of causes, you can't go on forever. Why? Because Aquinas says so. What was the first cause? God. So, by the way, to break things up a little bit, there's a joke I think it might have been Bertrand Russell's joke. Although, to be honest, I first heard it from my dad. So this old lady, she's at a scientific conference, and these scientists, they're talking about what started the universe. And like, so one scientist goes up and says, well, as we know from our experiments now, we now have quite a good idea of like what holds the Earth in its orbit, why things haven't disintegrated. And the old lady raises her hand and she says, excuse me. And the scientist says, well, there'll be time for questions at the end. And she says, no, but you're wrong. And the scientist says, okay, well, tell me. And she's like, well, you said you just figured out what holds the Earth up. But like, I hope you know that it's just a giant turtle. And the scientist says, sorry? And she says, it's a giant turtle. Like, everyone knows that. It's a turtle that holds the Earth up. And the scientist says, okay, well, what holds that turtle up? And she says, well, another turtle. And he goes, well, what holds that turtle up? And the old lady looks at him, and you can tell she just thinks he's so dumb. And she looks at him and she says, my dear boy, it's turtles all the way down. So, probably the sort of argument that Aquinas would hate. It's a classic. All right, on to the third argument.
Like a wordplay or something? All the way down.
We need to do another class on American humor.
Right.
We'll start all the way from vaudeville, go up to the 21st century.
Right.
That actually would be pretty fun. So, third argument. Thanks for bearing with me. I know this is difficult. I know Aquinas isn't the most fun guy to hang out with. He doesn't seem like he'd be great at a party. St. Augustine, on the other hand, does seem like he'd be great at a party, or at least before he gave up alcohol and women. But Thomas Aquinas, third argument on the existence of God. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. All right. So the third way to prove the existence of God is taken from what's possible and what's necessary, and this is how it goes. We find in nature things that are possible to be, impossible, and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. Okay, this is just a complicated way of saying we find things in nature that exist and things which don't exist, which die. And remember, they don't have a great idea of what causes things to appear and disappear. For example, they didn't know that, like, by the way, sorry if there's noise in the background here. So they don't know, like, where mold on bread comes from. So it's a little magical for someone like Thomas Aquinas. So he just says they're found to be generated, so they exist from somewhere, and then they corrupt. So then they disappear. They die for some reason. And consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time it's not. So he's saying nothing has always existed, because if anything ever could have not existed, then then it wouldn't exist. So then at one point it wouldn't exist. So therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. So if at some point nothing nothing could have existed, then at one point nothing did exist. Now, if this were true, if there was one point at which nothing did exist, even now there'd be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. So this is a pretty similar argument to the first two at this point. He's saying, if at any point there could have been nothing, then how would anything have gotten started? It would have needed something which existed to bring it out. So therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. Thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Alright, he's saying, if at one point nothing was in existence, nothing would have come into existence, so we would be living in a world where nothing exists, and we know that's not true. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible. There must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. So, what does that mean? Well, he's saying it's not possible that something, it's possible, for example, mold grows on this bread. It's possible mold doesn't grow on this bread. But the existence of which is necessary is something like smoke from a fire, right? If wood is burning, there will be smoke. There has to be smoke. There's not just a possibility of there being smoke. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. So when there's fire on wood, there has to be smoke. But that's only true because the wood is on fire. So, pretty similar argument again. It is impossible to go on infinity and necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already proved in regard to efficient causes. So he himself brings it back to the argument before. He says, you can't just keep going back. You need something, therefore we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity. We have to think of something which had to exist. Just like smoke from a fire, but it wasn't received from anything, it caused in others their necessity. So nothing made it exist, instead it made other things exist. It made the first wood, it made the first fire, whatever. This all men speak of as God. Alright. Again. Fact. If everything is possible not to be, then at one point there could have been nothing in existence. So if everything is possible not to have some point existed, then at some point there was nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. The only way things come into existence is something already existing. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. So in my own words, Aristotelian argument, everything can either exist or not exist. Its natural state is to not exist, and something else has to bring it into existence. This is totally Aristotle right here. Again, we've got the classification, we've got the cause, and it's pretty clever, because it is pretty close to the second law of thermodynamics. Matter is never created or destroyed. And it's also, I sort of like this part. It's like this argument from probability. If there was a chance of at some point nothing existing, then if we imagine a huge amount of time, then at some point everything's gonna not exist at the same time. Alright? And so something has to make things exist, and that thing's called God. Whew. Alright, 3 arguments down, 2 more to go. Aquinas is tough, but he hasn't beaten us yet. Alright, 4th argument. The 4th way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. So gradation means more or less, right? Like, gradations of color. It's like more blue, less blue, whatever. So among beings, there are some more or less good, true, noble, and the like. And it's funny he says among beings. So they do have like these moral ideas of animals, for instance, whether they're good animals, bad animals, noble animals, ignoble animals. So he doesn't just say among people. He says among beings. Everything is, sort of judged like this. More or less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter, according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. So this is a Aristotelian way of thinking about things. He's saying more or less are predicated of different things according to which they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum. So you say something is hot because it reminds you of the hottest thing. You say something is pretty because it reminds you of the prettiest thing. Okay? According to Sir St. Thomas Aquinas, there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and something which is uttermost being. Alright? So according to St. Thomas here, you call something true when it reminds you of the truest. You call something good when it reminds you of the best. For those things which are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as is written in Metaphors 2. Alright, here he gets a little tricky. He says, essentially, remember the degrees of perfection are living, thinking, being. So things which are more perfect are being over things which are less perfect. So essentially, he's saying, once you talk about like the greatest whatever, you're going to say whatever is the greatest also has to exist, because that's one of the degrees of perfection. So now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus. So here he uses cause in a rather confusing way. It seems like he's trying to say it's part of what makes it up. So as in fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all heat things, hot things. So he's saying, if you describe something that's hot, you're saying there's something of fire in it. So when you call something, cause there being goodness in every other perfection, when you call something good or noble, you're saying they have something of God in them. And we know that in order for it to be perfect, it has to exist. Therefore, God has to exist. Because if you're saying they're good, that means there's something you're saying there's something in them making them be good, which is God. Alright. So, fact. More and less are predicated of different things according as they resemble in their different ways something is maximum. The thing is said to be hotter, more nearly resembles that which is hottest. Again, if you say more hot, less hot, you're saying it resembles what's the maximum, the hottest. The maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. So everything hot has something of fire in it. So there must be everything which calls their being, goodness, and every other perfection. This we call God. Everything that exists, everything that's good, everything that's perfect in any way has to have something which is like making them that way. That's God. Alright, so we've got Aristotelian argument, we've got our categorization of objects based on various attributes, like hot or beautiful, and how much of that attribute they have. We can also describe things based on their perfection. So as I mentioned, perfection is this complicated word. Thomas uses it in all these weird ways. So just as we compare hot things to the hottest thing possible, we compare perfect things to the most perfect thing possible, which is what causes them. What's the most perfect thing possible? God. Therefore, God exists. People have had problems with this argument above all of them for so long, because people are like, it seems unfair to bring God into existence by word games. I mean, I sort of see where he's coming from here. If you take his word for it, that like the reason why things are hot is because they have something of fire in them, then I guess it makes sense that like you would say the reason why things are good is they have something that's like super good in them. But it does seem a little bit like, it seems a little questionable. All right. Fifth argument. We're so close. We're almost there. He hasn't beaten us yet. All right. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. All right. The fifth way is taken from the way things are governed, from the way things are controlled. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. Natural bodies being planets here. There's a point to this. They're acting for an end. This is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. All right. So he's saying planets, even though they don't think of anything, they still act to obtain the best result. What exactly is the best result? I guess according to Aquinas, it's going in orbit. Again, he's using best here in a very slippery way. As I told you, he does that. Whenever he's like not quite sure of his argument, he uses words in a pretty slippery way. He says, hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, so it's not by luck, but by design, that they achieve their end. So now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. So he's saying the reason that planets are in orbit, like the planets didn't decide to be in orbit, so it need to be someone to put them in orbit with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, right? So if you see an arrow, in a bullseye, you don't think the arrow decided to hit the bullseye itself. You say, oh yeah, the archer did that. The archer, aimed it and shot it. Said, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. All right, end of the fifth argument. All right, after this, I sort of want to tell one more American joke. I feel like I'm going to get this class appreciating American humor by the end of it. All right, I'm going to finish this argument and I'm going to tell my joke. Okay, fact. So we see things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. This is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. So that things without intelligence do things which seem to be like they're trying to achieve something, and they're trying to achieve the best result. And whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. All right. So why is it that planets are in orbit? Because someone put them in orbit who knew what they were doing. Some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So here again, we've got Aristotelian argument. Everything acts towards a certain end. That end is the best end. All right. So, yeah, again, you can certainly argue with Aristotle saying not everything's acting towards an end, or not everything's acting towards the best end, but whatever. So, like perfect, he's using best in a confusing way. He's doing what something was designed to do as well as something good. Yeah, again, I do have a problem when Thomas Aquinas does this, because I don't. I do think he's being pretty deliberate about being slippery here. Okay, so, but yeah, why does everything act in a certain way? Because God. So, conclusion. So, it's easy to disagree with these premises, and as we do have some extra time, I think we will go over some common criticisms of these. And it's also easy to criticize these arguments based on the fact that they use God as an easy answer for the paradoxes they bring up. So even if you take Thomas Aquinas' word seriously for why these are problems, it does seem like he just says God as the immediate answer. He doesn't even try to consider any other answers. But, it's best to think about these arguments as an intelligent man dealing with potent intellectual and social forces. So I don't think these are definitive proofs for the existence of God. I mean, for one thing, I read and understand these proofs, and I still don't believe in God. But you can certainly think about it as like an intelligent man. Thomas Aquinas, he's a professor, he's a preacher. He's getting, first of all this knowledge from the Greeks, brought to him through the Islamic world, and he's getting all this faith and whatever from Christianity. And he's trying to combine the two. He's trying to figure out how he makes them all make sense. And the reason why they're still important today is they've had a huge impact. Like, the Catholic Church, first of all, in the Western world has been enormously powerful for close to 2,000 years. And as during the time that Aquinas was living up to, hundreds of years afterwards, it was so powerful. I mean, they had an army, they had all the wealth, they had all the land. So, they take this stuff very, very seriously. So it's important to know it. So here's the interesting thing. So Thomas Aquinas, he's a man of science and reason and a man of faith. We won't go through it, but he actually writes quite a bit about science and trying to understand the natural world. And he's also, of course, a priest, and he's a friar, and he, believes in the Catholic Church as the ultimate authority. And the Catholic Church takes him seriously enough that they sort of adopt the same thing. Sometimes they champion science and reason, and sometimes they don't. You'll see them supporting scientists with money, with positions, whatever, and then other times, pretty famously with Copernicus, for instance, Earth revolves around the sun, they use all of their power and influence to stop the progress of science. So it's an interesting role that the church adopts. So, and above all, I think his works reflect this new reality coming from the ancient Greeks to now. There's no longer one tradition. There's no longer one authority. There's a bunch of different authorities. There's a bunch of different influences, and philosophers have to deal with that. And they do in different ways. And, this was Aquinas' answer. All right, cool. So let's take a bit of a breather. I'll tell a joke, maybe more for my sake than for your sake. And then we'll go over some criticisms of this. Whew. All right. All right. So, breather/joke time. By the way, write any questions you have. I know this was very complicated. Write any questions you have in the QQ chat. So here's my joke. So this man is walking along a country road because already has his hand on his forehead. He's not a huge fan of my jokes. He'll come around to it. He'll come around. So this man's walking down this country road, and he sees these fence posts. And on fence post after fence post, there's a bullseye, and in the center of the bullseye, there's a bullet hole. And he sees this for hundreds of fence posts, and he's like, wow, whoever lives here must be like just the most incredible marksman. They must be so good, like at shooting. Like I can't wait to meet this guy. He's probably pretty amazing. So he comes across this like farmhand. It's this farmer. He's a young guy. He's dirty. He's got his overalls on. He's got a corn hat. Got the straw in his mouth. He says, "Hey, who's this marksman? Like he should really go into the big city. He'd make millions. He's that good at shooting." And the farmer says, "Oh, that's actually me." And the guy's like, "Really? Really? How's that possible?" And the farmer's like, "Well, And the man's like, "No, I don't. Like, you should. Why are you farming? Like, you could be making millions." And the farmer's like, "Well, I'm not sure they'd like my technique in the big city." And the man says, I can't imagine what you could be doing that they'd object to, but sure, show me." And the farmer says, well, look at this. And the farmer sets up on a new fence post. He takes his rifle. He walks out like 100 yards. Takes close aim. Bang! Shoots it. Hits the fence post. And the man says, okay. Where were you aiming at? And the farmer says, "Well, wait a sec." The farmer walks away, comes back with a paintbrush and a paint bucket. And then the farmer carefully paints the target around the bullet hole. And the farmer says, "Yeah, I'm not sure they'd like my technique in the big city." The man says, "I don't think they would either."
Yeah, well, let's see where is the. Yeah, I see where. I'm not sure if the students understand. 没有，
没有，
是指哪儿打哪儿和打哪儿指哪儿之间的区别，各位听懂了吗？Well, now we can continue. This is very cold.
Yeah. Wait, what are these little jumping man?
What is little jumping man?
There's these little jumping man on the chat.
Oh yeah, sometimes people having certain things and having people robot kind of recognize it. Or like some I don't know which part of the conversation triggered that. Sometimes you reach happy birthday and you see a lot of things going.
Man.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my career as a stand-up comedian may have to wait. May have to wait a bit. But let's go over some objections people have had to these arguments.
This one thing. 大家觉得声音小是吗？整个从刚才1个半小时里面声音都小吗？大家1个半小时里面声音都觉得小吗？Okay. Some of them say your voice is a little
Choppy?
Yeah, Okay. They say my voice is. Never mind. You're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sitting in front of you here this way. I'm sitting. 我在电脑后面，我不是在电脑前面。
I actually totally understood what you just said.
Yeah. I mean, 电脑前面。
Yeah, exactly. That's,
yeah.
I'm pretty proud of myself.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I guess we're good. Later I'm gonna explain that joke. I try to connect that with Aquinas.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, Aquinas paints targets.
The problem is people probably don't understand the word trifleman or trifle or marksman or target. That's the problem.
There are a lot of things.
Yeah.
Should have had a visual aid.
Yeah.
All right. So some common objections to the argument. as you guys see on my screen, so we're on argument 1. So first of all, one common objection is just like, well, you can disagree with his premises, right? First of all, his terms are weird about motion, putting into motion, like what exactly motion means, and also why you need a first mover, why you need, why it can't just be infinite. But that's not super interesting. Another argument, which there's this very popular book in America called The God Delusion, which was a British scientist arguing about why God doesn't exist. He actually addressed this argument, and he just says it's a God of the gaps argument. He says, you know, Aquinas asked this interesting question, and then he just answers God. And he doesn't, like, why is it that it has to be God? Why can't it be something else? So, and then like another argument, which I think is also sort of interesting, is once we get into Enlightenment era philosophers, a lot of them actually accept the idea of God as this so-called first mover. So the idea is like God, he sort of sets everything in motion and then he goes his own way. And Aquinas would have hated that, because Aquinas is like really big on this idea of God as, you know, he's actively interfering in human affairs. He's constantly, you know, for one thing, he's acting through people. But the problem is his argument, if you take him totally at his word, if you say he's totally right about everything, the only thing he really argues for here is things are started by God. But he has no argument for why you should believe that God still is present, why God still is acting. So, and you can see the same argument here, right? Even if you say, yeah, God caused everything, then, you know, you can do the same objections, either God of the gaps, or you can say, why can't it just be infinite? Or you can say, yeah, sure, God started things, but why does God still have to be acting? And for that matter, why does it have to be the Christian God? You know, who's to say the Hindus aren't right? You know, what makes you think your version of God is the right one? Not a great answer. All right. So now let's get to the fourth argument, because this one is sort of different from the first three. And by the way, that is traditionally how people classify these arguments. They have the first three, and then, oh man, got spyware pop-ups. All right, so they have the first three, which are all these infinite regression arguments, then the fourth and the fifth. So the fourth, first of all, as I've said, people say these are just word games, and it seems wrong that you can prove God by word games. And then, on the other hand, there's also sort of this argument that why does it have to be like the best, the goodness, whatever? And I actually read this argument on the internet where the guy was like, well, what if I said, what about when you say things that smell bad? And you say the things that smell bad, you're really comparing to things which smell really bad. And the thing which smells the worst is the cause of everything that smells bad. And that thing we call God. Like, yeah, sure, it's nice to say perfection is, you know, the cause of all the perfection is God. But you could put smelly, you could put pretty, you could put anything, you could put any adjective. So it doesn't seem like there's a great reason for why it has to be being or goodness. All right. Okay. And then the fifth one, I mean, we've already talked about this sort of use of the word best, which is a little questionable. And then we also, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed there. And I think, honestly, that's grown less and less true the more we understand about physical rules, like physical laws. Like, the more we understand about gravity, for instance, we don't need the idea of planets being kept up in the sky by God. We understand evolution. We don't need arguments about how well things are designed. So I think this argument was a lot better before we had a good understanding of science. So those are sort of some of the common objections to these arguments. We have 7 minutes left, looks like. So let's see if we can get a couple questions going. Are you manning the QQ chat?
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Is it like bad form to have the QQ chat open on my screen while screen sharing?
No, I mean, if you finish
right.
sorry.
All right, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm, yeah. Although, I opened it on my screen and I've got a video chat on. You want to join me on video chat?
Oh, sure.
There we go. All right.
So, what are you gonna do?
Well, I imagine this stuff was pretty tricky
Okay.
and admittedly pretty exhausting.
Yeah.
So I was hoping we could get some questions going for the last like 5 minutes.
Right. Okay.
Or if there are no questions, we can discuss amongst ourselves.
Right. Well, let's ask if there's any question. Here we go. What is the difference between living and being?
Okay. It's a good question. But like essentially, if you think of classification of things, we've got living, dead, and non-being. So a living thing has the potential to be living, right? Like a tree or a person, and then it also has the potential to be dead. And then like a dead guy, and then we've got non-living, like a rock or something. So then being is the difference between existing and non-existing. But Thomas Aquinas does get a little slippery sometimes with the distinction between being and living.
Yeah. It seems like living is part of being based on the description.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say everything that's living is being, but not everything that being is living.
Yeah, I see one comment is being means to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be the explanation. I think whatever Aquinas said makes sense. In a lot of ways. For his, especially, okay, so from what you taught, I think the most important notion that people need to keep in mind is his causality, and then the what's the other one?
Non-contradiction?
Yeah, non-contradiction. I think if you guys students keep that in mind, then everything is easier to understand. So non-contradiction means there's, it's about a property of a thing that cannot exist as, as it's like Schrodinger's cat. You cannot have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You cannot have the cat in the both live and dead. right? The other one is everything has a reason. So if you understand that, you will understand completely what or to a very large extent what Aquinas means by
Yeah.
the five the five ways of proving God existence. Yeah, so basically the five ways is repeatedly talking about, it dates back, God is there. So, and also I think one thing that we may get confused is because the image of God is so picturesque. Is there's a old guy, it's a white male with a beard. So people would automatically think, okay, so this is just a Western crap, and then you just put one of you guys out there.
Which is sort of what we did.
Yeah, that's what people have been doing, but that's apparently not Aquinas means.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so God is more like, it's people say the perfection is God, and then people say it's revealed by a revelation. But what it really means is God is perfection itself. Like God is the concept. It's not like God is a representative of the concept. God is a concept himself. And then the revelation is for the commons, for the mediocres to understand. Like that's what it means.
So if Thomas Aquinas is a real philosopher,
yeah,
I mean he's a real philosopher. I'm sort of with Bertrand Russell, in your pre-reading. I don't think he's as great a philosopher as his reputation is. Like, I think he's had way more influence than he should. But certainly in terms of dealing with very hard concepts and trying to do so in a logical fashion. And also, he did do a lot just bringing Aristotle to the Western world. And you have to remember, this is a time before the printing press. Books are very rare and very valuable because each book has to be, copied out by hand. So even if he had done nothing else but brought Aristotle to the Western world, that's a big thing. That's a big accomplishment. Okay, why does Captain say that? Are you Captain?
Yeah, I'm Captain.
Oh, Captain, my Captain. So you want to answer this?
Yeah, because it's the reason. Because God is the reason of everything. Reason itself, like the ultimate cause, is a concept. You can't find an object as an ultimate reason, right? That's what I understand. It must be something that's so abstract that it definitely is beyond our understanding. Because if it's an object, which we can see, we can touch, we can feel, then that's not beyond our imagination. Whatever things beyond our understanding must be something so abstract that does not exist as what we can feel of it.
Yeah. There's actually a quote by Isaac Newton that might be helpful. He actually said trying to understand the mind of God is like a dog trying to understand physics. So there's some extent to which, Aquinas, remember, he's explaining this, he's proving the existence of God, whatever, but there is also some point at which Aquinas is saying we lack like some of the abilities to really understand what God is. And so when they're saying things like, when you act, that's God acting through you, it does actually raise some questions about, like, how do you even think about God? If you thinking about God is really God acting through you thinking about God,
yeah,
I mean, it gets pretty complicated.
I mean, that totally makes sense. You can't prove it wrong. Well, you can't prove it, but you can't prove it wrong. So it's that means that the possibility is there, like that. And also, if you guys read sci-fi, like science fiction, so imagine a two-dimensional world. What revelation means, probably if we just dip our one finger into that two-dimensional world, and then what those creatures in the two-dimensional world will see the object changing its shape and appear and disappear.
You read Flatland?
No, I didn't, but it's like,
oh, okay,
yeah. That's a concept, right?
Yeah.
So it's if you just
just put your hands or anything that goes through it. We understand why it changes shape, but the two-dimensional creatures would definitely not understand. They say, "Hey, this is God. This is the revelation," and it goes through all kinds of forms. So the same thing, if you think it in a crazy way, that a four-dimensional creature is appearing in this world and dipping his fingers and appear in all kinds of shapes, and sometimes it's the shape of Jesus, sometimes it's the shape of like whatever the Chinese myth. That's also possible, right? So when people think about that, it's why it's like that, and they got a conclusion saying this is definitely beyond our imagination. So it can explain it with the words of truth or the language from the three-dimensional world, because we're still trying to figure out perspectives, and our own world got confusing, right?
Yeah. Oh, one other thing that I think is important is, so Aquinas uses a lot of specialized terms, which is, he's actually not as bad as it gets. I didn't assign the really bad ones, but if we ever got into like the German philosophers like Hegel, they love making up their own words. So good notes. He tried to read Hegel. It's awful.
I almost kill myself.
So the thing is, when you're trying to understand Aquinas, you do have to understand the words he's using, especially when he uses words in a different way than normal people are using them, especially when he's saying perfection or best or whatever. But also when he's saying things like potentiality and actuality. That is a big part of his argument, like the definitions of some of these words.
Yeah.
And that'll be true for all the philosophers we read. Make a special effort so you can understand the terms they're using. Because that's really the start of the argument, is understanding the terms they're using, which means understanding where they're coming from.
That makes one of the three ways of description really valuable. So basically, Thomas Aquinas already realized that people may mistaken. So he stated, sometimes when you understand it wrong, you may take the equivocal kind of a meaning, right? Like the obscured meaning, and whatever you understand from your context is not what I mean. Yeah. So to sum up, definition really matters here. Because when we think about God, we clearly have different image in mind already. So that makes any explanation about it, and then people kind of solidify their image by just you're talking bullshit. Right? Because it's not fit into the image of God in my mind. Yep. I think.
All right.
Yep.
Good.
Confused. Good confused. Or is it confused so much that I want to give it up, or in a good way that you're confused, that therefore I need to rate more on that? Or
I think they're excited. I think they're ready for 10 more hours of Thomas Aquinas.
Cool. Yeah. If I think I'll talk to them later, maybe. And so much for today's class. And actually, I need to about the recording. We may change the stage. I need to go to the PC soon.
Oh, okay.
Well, so much for today's class, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. And I'm waiting for your thoughts on that. I will catch up with you guys later. Not today, but later. Okay? I'll give a very specific. Trevor and I are going to discuss about more on the refinement of the class, giving more specific questions before you start the pre-rating and giving you specific a self-test or assignment after class. But just to give us a little bit more time, we'll set it up later. Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
再见. How do I turn this up again?